A Zelda game without dungeons is like a monster maze with no maze. Like, sure, you've got one hunky Netherlander man running a YouTube channel all by himself, but without the
Bandit?
maze, where are the theories? Where are the analyses? Where's the super sweet dungeon lore?
Bandit.
Oh hey, it's Dawn from Monster Maze. How long have you been standing there, exactly?
A while. I mean, you called me to come over, remember? You said, and I quote, Donnie, dude, like there's this huge rash on my back that I need to help.
Did I say that? I don't remember saying that at all.
Well, you did. I even brought some aloe vera cream.
Well, you know, no rashes here. Definitely not ones covering my entire back and growing hair in strange places. Hey, since you're here, why don't you help me cover the dungeon lore of Ocarina of Time? Dungeons are kind of your thing.
Yeah, I guess they are kind of my thing.
Yeah, so let's talk dungeons and never mention rashes again.
Whatever you say, man. Oh, and by the way, spoiler alert, obviously.
The first dungeon we're going to fully explain would be the Dodongos Cavern, located on Death Mountain. Oh, what's that? You're wondering where the first dungeon in the game, the Great Deku Tree, is?
Well, for the other half of the dungeons, make sure you visit the video over on my channel after you're done here. There's a ton of lore in these games, so splitting it up into 2 videos is just easier. Or at least that's what Bandit is scripting me to say right now.
Good job, my puppet. Good job.
Yeah. Anyway, most fans know or can assume correctly that Dodongo's Cavern is the cave from which the famous Dodongo dinosaurs originate. I mean, it is in the name after all. But what's more obscure about the cavern is the history surrounding the disappearance and reappearance of these fire-breathing lizards. But let's talk about what the cave is currently used for first before arriving at Speculation Station. The race of volcano dwellers that most fans of the series are very familiar with would be the boulder-like Gorons, who in fact made their first appearance in Ocarina of Time. These rock people actually eat rocks, which is pretty much their only source of food and nutrition. And to take things a step further, apparently the only or perhaps best rocks that the Gorons could feast upon for sustenance came from Dodongo's Cavern. Because of this, it makes sense that the cavern itself would be a heavily mined area, with tons of rooms and hallways and levers and buttons and doors and what have you. It's also why after the Goron leader Darunia refused to give Ganondorf the Goron Ruby, the Gerudo King tried to force them into obeying him by blocking the entrance to the cavern with a big rock, preventing the Gorons from entering and being able to eat food.
Wait a sec. Don't Gorons, eat rocks? Why didn't they just eat the one that Ganondorf placed in the entrance of the...
But don't ask questions that don't have answers, Bandit. It's easier that way. Anyway, without easy access to the cavern, the Gorons were apparently on the verge of extinction. Yet still, they did not give up on the Goron Ruby though, so props to them for sticking to their guns. Fortunately, a 10-year-old was able to enter the cavern by blowing up the almighty ceiling rock with a single bomb flower and defeating the ancient dinosaurs inside, thus re-enabling entrance to the cavern and saving the Gorons from their starvation. So now for the more speculative side of things, and Mr. Bandit, this one's all you.
Well, to start things off, we have reason to believe that the big boulder in the entrance of the cavern isn't the only thing Ganondorf did here. Actually, far from it. Darunia states that, quote, ancient creatures have infested Dodongo's cavern. This would imply 2 things. One, that the ancient creatures are in fact the Dodongos themselves, and that prior to the events happening here, Dodongo's cavern was actually clear of these ancient creatures. Hence why Darunia is freaking out about their reappearance. While their reappearance isn't explained explicitly, we can assume that since Ganondorf also revives another ancient long since deceased lizard dinosaur creature later on in the game named Volvagia, also on Death Mountain, that the reemergence of Dodongos is also due to Ganondorf's magic. In our opinion, it was most likely the ancient Goron hero who wielded the Megaton hammer that was responsible for ridding the volcano of Volvagia and all the Dodongos long ago, the biggest of which still has its skeleton visible to this day. But that's neither here nor there. Another feature of the cavern that's harder to explain would be the booby traps located everywhere. There are BMOS enemies sitting ready to fry you if you enter their gaze, and there are rooms like the Razor Maze or the one with the giant staircase that needs to literally be blown up to be climbable. Stuff like this doesn't really fit into the rather innocent mining for food explanation.
Yeah, I don't think the Gorons would need to booby trap their rock food mine when they're the only species in the world that mines rocks for food. I guess this one can probably also be chalked up to the work of Ganondorf. You know, in the case the Gorons wisened up and ate their way inside the cavern. Besides, there's also Lizalfos inside, which are always depicted as servants of the forces of evil. So there you have it. The history, purpose, and events surrounding Dodongo's Cavern explained with a nice little Christmas bow on top. Moving on.
The next dungeon we're going to cover would be the Forest Temple, and this is a big one that's also been theorized over for a long time. But again, let's just start off simple by covering what we know factually about the area in the game. It's an entire hidden fortress or castle that's located deep within the Lost Woods. So far into it, in fact, that I'd imagine most, if not all, wayward adventurers who may be searching for it would be eternally lost in the woods before ever even catching a glimpse of the temple, doomed to turn into Stalfos for the rest of time. But for those who know the way to the Sacred Grove and beyond and who are able to enter, they'll discover that the interior is just as mysterious as the exterior. The temple is expansive and very obviously handmade, with rooms and rugs and pictures and torches and also ghosts which haunt the place. Literally none of this is explained even a little bit in the game, and the only connections with the outside world that we can see would be the Forest Sage icon located above the entrances of the doors and the Phantom Ganon boss, which is a pretty clear connection to Ganondorf, who obviously placed the Phantom Ganon inside the temple in order to stop the Forest Sage from awakening. The Forest Sage being Saria, who entered the Forest Temple due to her being able to feel an evil wind blowing out of it. Must resist making fart joke. Also, there are some giant blocks inside the castle that strangely feature the Gerudo symbol on them, but that is literally the end of everything we know about the mysterious castle in the woods, at least in game. Mr. Maze, let's get theoretical.
Certainly, sir. Like Bandit mentioned, the Forest Temple has been one of the most intriguing and theorized about pieces of Zelda lore since the release of Ocarina of Time over 20 years ago. With that said, let's try to come up with a safe conclusion that wraps up everything going on here. First and foremost, what is the purpose of a castle or fortress, which the Forest Temple clearly is, given its stone block walls and battlements located on top. No matter how you slice it or what real-life culture you'd like to derive the answers from, a castle is always used for the purpose of living under a nearly impenetrable physical protection, hence the stone structures. Due to the expenses that go into creating such a monumental piece of safe housing, usually only the very rich and well-off royal or noble families could even afford to build or live in one. And in the Forest Temple, the interior of the castle is also rather nice, all things considered. You can tell it's been abandoned for a while, but there's a grand main hall with an elevator, outdoor balconies, a gazebo, a well, a garden, and many more nice things that were probably there because whoever built this place was well off. Speaking of the builders though, I think it's improbable that the Forest Temple was put here by the royal family of Hyrule, simply because there's quite literally no royal family symbolism present anywhere inside the castle, except for the boss room, which is riddled with the Triforce everywhere on the ground, but we'll get back to that. The most obvious and likely most accurate answer as to who was responsible for creating this majestic castle would be the four Poe sisters present within. And for a bit more proof, just look at their clothing, or more specifically the clothing of the main purple sister, Meg. None of the other Poes in the game, or in the franchise as a whole for that matter, have jewelry, but Meg here does. It's a very fancy looking head jewel like a tiara, and historically tiaras were worn by royalty, especially in medieval times. So automatically we can come to the conclusion that the castle was built by a rich family, and that said family was most likely the Poe sisters. Now, two questions remain. Who were the Poe sisters, and what happened to them to turn them into, Poes, which are described as hateful, lingering spirits?
Great question, sir. Let's start with that first one. I think the symbols of the Forest Sage present all over the place in the Forest Temple is very telling as to who the Poe sisters were in life. And this suggestion may be a bit shocking to believe, but just bear with me for a moment. And also remember that this is all just my theory, and you are more than welcome to, as always, believe whatever you would choose to. I'd like to remind you briefly that there is another entire group of sages that we've never seen in-game, referred to as the Ancient Sages, of which Rauru, the Sage of Light, is the last remaining member. We can assume based on this information that this likely means that the ancient or original sages were also each attributed to their own respective elements, such as forest and water and shadow and light. And that must mean that the Sage of the Forest had an entirely different identity prior to Saria being awakened as a sage. So what if the old Sage of the Forest lived in this very temple? I mean, Saria even refers to herself as the awakened Sage of the Forest Temple, so this would only make sense. Plus, there's a Triforce warping pad located just outside the entrance to the temple, which was present before Saria's awakening and implies very strongly that the temple was the home of an older sage. Now, how do we connect the Poe sisters to the old Sage of the Forest Temple, you're probably wondering? Simple. The identity of the previous Sage of the Forest is the Poe sisters, or should I say, Amy, and the identity of the previous Sage of Fire is Joelle. The previous Sage of Water is Beth, and the previous Sage of Shadow would be Meg. I know that's a tad weird to conceptualize, but think about it. If the Forest Temple was built by a rich or royal family, that has to be the Poe sisters. And since they built a castle and hid inside, that would also make sense if they were sages who needed to be protected from potential threats. And if the hidden room underneath the castle that's littered with Triforce emblems all over the platform is some sort of old prayer room where the sages would go to pray to the gods, it would also make sense that they were each sages of their own elements, which is why they together were the only ones that could open the way to the Triforce prayer room by combining their flames, each of which were different colors, which is also a very key sage-ism. The only sage that would be missing from this picture would be the Sage of Spirit, who was reawakened as Nabooru in the adult timeline. However, there are Gerudo blocks located inside the Forest Temple, so perhaps the previous Sage of Spirit was also a Gerudo, who had close ties with the Sage sisters in life and provided them with some materials for the castle?
It also makes sense for the Poe sisters to be the Sage sisters, since they were probably still alive up until Ganondorf cursed the Forest Temple with an evil wind, which probably means he entered inside, killed the sisters, turning them into malicious ghosts, and corrupting the prayer room with a phantom copy of himself. The biggest piece of evidence against this explanation, however, would be the Triforce warping pads located in all the other temples, such as the Fire, Water, Shadow, and Spirit Temple, as well as the Temple of Time. Also, when the new sages are awakened, most of them at least imply that they're meant to protect their respective elemental temples, which would suggest that the ancient sages lived in each of these respective places. But given the evidence we've been going over regarding their possible former identities as the Poe sisters, it could be that most of them had retreated into the stronghold, i.e. the Forest Temple, once the Hyrulean Civil War broke out amongst the other races of Hyrule. It would also explain why the Sage of Spirit, likely an old Gerudo, would have stayed away, as the land of the Gerudo is considered to be outside the borders of Hyrule. But we've spent enough time going over the Forest Temple, and while this isn't a perfect explanation, it does wrap up most, if not all, of the questions that people have regarding the mysterious fortress.
Moving on though, the next dungeon we're going to cover is the Water Temple. And to be honest, I actually sort of completely covered this in my first lore of the video, the one covering the bosses of Ocarina of Time. Actually, I kind of covered a lot of this in that video, but you know what? I said I was going to do the dungeon video, so here we are. But anyway, if you watched that one, you probably know where I'm going with this, but if you haven't, allow me to briefly summarize. Basically, according to good old Kapora Gaybora, aka Rauru the Ancient Sage of Light, the Water Temple was built by the Zora to worship the water spirits. I personally believe that the puzzle-like structure is so puzzling in its structure because the completion of the temple is in and of itself a form of worship from the Zora people, a journey that would purify the mind and body. And speaking of purifying the mind, that's also why I think the Dark Link room was created. It's a completely hallucinogenic room that's entire purpose is to become a dark reflection of the traveler looking to conquer the temple. And for proof of this that I actually didn't mention in the previous video, just pay attention to Link's own reflection in the water as he progresses through the room. He starts off with it, but once he crosses the tree in the center, his reflection is gone and has emerged as Dark Link, created by the room, who awaits to challenge the traveler with a fight directly from the depths of their own heart. Navi even confirms that Dark Link is none other than Link himself, so this makes sense. Obviously, Ganondorf had some shenanigans at play here, sticking a weird water-sucking but also water-producing amoeba known as Morpha inside the temple, but that's a topic, or rather was a topic, for another video. For a bit more of an in-depth explanation on the temple, ironically, feel free to check out the Lore of the Bosses video on Ocarina of Time.
Last but not least, let's talk Spirit Temple, and oh boy, this is a fun one. Starting as always with the in-game factual pieces of lore we're given, the Spirit Temple is a, well, temple located deep within the desert of the Gerudo across an area so plagued by sandstorms that it's referred to as the Haunted Wasteland. And it actually is haunted. You even have to follow a Poe to cross this section safely. But once you do, you're met with the Desert Colossus, which is a giant depiction of the goddess of the sand, which is most likely actually Hylia herself. But for more information on all the logic and evidence behind that, check out Bandit's previous Skyward Sword boss lore video. There's also the Triforce warping pad here that would imply a Hylia connection as well. Inside the Desert Colossus rests the Hidden Spirit Temple, which prior to the events of the game served as a hideout for Nabooru and her followers until Ganondorf rose to power, after which it was referred to as the hideout of Ganondorf and his goons. Oh, and his mothers, or mother. It's complicated. Anyway, after Link is able to solve the problems the temple presents both as a kid and as an adult, Nabooru awakens as the new Sage of Spirit, and well, that just about sums up everything we know for a fact about the dungeon from the game itself.
So now let's speculate. Lots of fans believe that the Spirit Temple could have become the also very well-known Arbiter's Grounds dungeon from Twilight Princess, especially since the encyclopedia flat out states that the grounds are connected to the Spirit Temple, in those exact words and nothing more actually. But as I went over in the Twilight Princess dungeon video, there are several reasons to believe that the Arbiter's Grounds is actually much older than the Spirit Temple and that it was built for an entirely different purpose. The two locations are connected by both being located within the expansive Gerudo Desert and by the appearances of the Goddess of the Sand, but that's about it. According to the official Ocarina of Time game guide, the Spirit Temple was built by the ancestors of the Gerudo, and given that the entire thing is built within a giant statue of a goddess, I'd wager that it's a pretty safe bet that the Spirit Temple was always meant to be a place of worship for the Sand Goddess, especially given the fact that there is another giant statue of the same individual located inside. And honestly, there's not too much more to be said about it. I mean, in either case, whether the Sand Goddess actually represents Hylia or another unknown deity, it makes sense that if the Arbiter's Grounds was built as a worship by combat arena thing, the Spirit Temple would instead be built as more of a worship through church thing, I guess. But also in line with the strange appearance of the Sand Goddess would be the strange appearances of several other symbols present in the dungeon. For instance, outside the entrance to the temple / on the bottom of the Desert Colossus statue, there are serpents depicted eating one another. In the 3DS version, these serpents are green. This is oddly similar to the Ouroboros-like symbol from Tears of the Kingdom's recent trailer, and for a whole bunch of reasons that I don't have time to go into in this video, could also be used as further proof for the Sand Goddess Hylia identity thing. The other strange symbol would be the flying or winged eyeball symbol located above some of the doorways. Astute fans will immediately recognize the connection between this depiction and another well-known Zelda villain known as Vati. A connection could also be loosely drawn between Vati and the Sheikah, and then between the ancient Sheikah and the ancient builders of the Spirit Temple, but that is so much speculation said in so little time, so we'll just end that right now. In a nutshell though, we know as much about the Spirit Temple as we don't know, but what we do know at least so far seems to point to the simple conclusion of an ancient worship site for an ancient deity built by ancient ancestors of the Gerudo, which eventually Twinrova set up camp in and started brainwashing other Gerudo women. Fun stuff. But there you have it, the complete list of all the dungeons.
Half of the dungeons.
Oh yeah, the complete list of half of the dungeons in Ocarina of Time. Sir Maze, any ideas as to where these lore-crazed Zelda fanatics can find the other half of the list?
Well, my friend, I have just the answer. I mean, it is a collaboration, so it shouldn't be a big mystery where the other half is, but for those who don't know me, the missing 4 can be found over on my channel, Monster Maze, where I cover everything Zelda and more. Mostly Zelda, but I do have my wacky moments. Anyway, to Mr. Bandit, I say thank you as always for inviting me over. It's always a pleasure working with you, and yeah. I'm just gonna stop talking now. Goodbye.
Thank you so much for watching. If you enjoyed the video, or at least our efforts into making it, please consider leaving a like to get it spread around on YouTube, and subscribe if you haven't already, because we are doing some awesome stuff here at Bandit Games, and together we can make this channel really something special. Also, the videos will only get more interesting from here. So yeah, stick around. Huge thanks as always to my Bandit crew, of which I have some names to announce. Say hello to Mickey P and Nick L, who recently joined up on Patreon. Thank you guys so much. I do what I do because of you. That's all I've got for this one, so be sure to follow me on my socials, and I will see you over on Monster Maze's channel. This is Bandit, heading over there. Peace!